All right. So far in our exploration of civics and how we've become the nation we are today, we've talked about the English influences of the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights. We've also talked a lot about the role of Enlightenment thinkers. Remember, the goal of the Enlightenment thinkers was to reduce human suffering and allow humans to be as free as possible. The result was the founders had a good understanding of what people ought to have the right to do. That is, free speech and the like. The founders summed up Enlightenment ideals as they penned the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. Before we go too much further, let's just briefly revisit Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and Montesquieu. So remember, Thomas Hobbes, he was an English philosopher. He was heavily influenced by the English Civil War in the mid 17th century, and he believed that even a bad king is better than a revolution. In his version of the state of nature, which is any kind of time without government, is nasty, brutish, and short. That's sort of his tagline. His ideal government was an absolute monarchy, and he believed that people made a social contract with their king, and in doing so, they agreed to give up their rights in order to receive his protection. And then we have John Locke. John Locke is also an English philosopher, but he disagrees with Hobbes about what human nature looks like. He believes the state of nature is not that bad, and it's much better than having a bad king. Locke believes that the ideal form of government is a representative democracy. And when it comes to the social contract, Locke believes the social contract is with government, and the government protects our rights, or else we overthrow them. Okay? He believes that people have natural rights or unalienable rights to life, liberty, and property, and that no legitimate government can take them away. Locke believes that revolution is necessary when you have bad government, when government is no longer protecting the rights of the people. And we see Locke's ideas illustrated most boldly, in the Declaration of Independence. And then we have Jean-Jacques Rousseau. All right, he's a Swiss philosopher. He was born a little bit later than Hobbes and Locke, and he's the first one to actually use the term social contract. Hobbes and Locke never actually say social contract, they're just talking about obligations between the people and the government. And Rousseau believes that human nature is good except when society corrupts it. All right, he believes that the ideal government is a direct democracy. He also believes that the social contract is made between people, not with a government or king. So we must agree with one another to do what is good for the collective so that we will all prosper. If you've ever heard the old adage, high tide raises all boats, that's kind of what Rousseau is talking about, that we must work together. All right, he argued that people had a right to determine how they were governed. We will see this coined as popular sovereignty or self-government. Okay, that's the first kind of mention of the term voting or the idea of voting. All right, he believes that citizens agree to give up part of their freedom to the government in exchange for protection. If the government can no longer protect the people's rights, he believes that the government must be replaced. Rousseau gives us the clearest justification for revolution. He also believes that no man can have absolute power over another. So, in terms of revolution, Rousseau believes that the more the better, okay? That governments should not outlive their usefulness, that we as a society have the duty to make sure that the government is still fulfilling their roles. And lastly, we talk about Montesquieu. Montesquieu gives us the idea of a separation of powers, that government should be divided into three branches of government, that the idea of checks and balances must exist at a governmental level so that one branch cannot become more powerful than the others. Now, after all of that recap, we can finally get to the causes of the American Revolution. So, what caused the American Revolution? Was the colonial life so terrible? Well, we're about to find out. Now, before we get into the actual causes, we have to establish what England was actually doing in terms of setting up colonies. And this comes from the term mercantilism. Now, it's an economic policy that is designed to maximize the exports and minimize the imports for an economy. It promotes imperialism, tariffs, and subsidies on traded goods to achieve that goal. Okay, it generates wealth and is stimulated by the accumulation of profitable balances. Okay, that means when English establishes colonies, they are making a profit for themselves. That is, power is equal to wealth. The more wealthy, okay, that England becomes, the more powerful they come. The more powerful they become, the more wealthy they become. Also, under this policy, this economic policy, the colonies are not allowed to trade with each other. They're not allowed to find exports or imports from other places. They can only trade with the mother country, and in this case, England. So imagine before we had Amazon. Okay, I know many of you probably don't remember life before Amazon, but in the old days, people would buy electronics, especially from Best Buy. Now, Best Buy probably has some of the worst prices because Amazon can just about undercut every major big box merchant in our economic sphere right now. So, for England to only require their colonies to trade with them, they can set the prices, both imports and exports. They can set what types of goods that the colonists can have, and that exerts a tremendous amount of control over the colonies. So now that we know that the British are operating under mercantilism, in 1651, they pass legislation. So the Parliament passes legislation known as the Navigation Acts. All right. And that required that all shipments to the colonies had to go through English ports. So again, we know the type of economic policy England is attempting to create. And now through legislation, it is putting that into practice. Now remember, the Navigation Acts went into effect in 1651, okay? And a lot of the things that it applied to were things like tobacco and sugar and things of that sort. But essentially from 1651 until the outbreak of the French and Indian War in 1756, the British were pretty hands off with the colonists. They did not interfere in many areas. At this point, England was more concerned with making a profit from the colonies rather than kind of stepping into their everyday life. So generally speaking, the French and Indian War pitted the colonies of British America against those of New France, and each side was supported by military units from their parent country and American Indian allies. In 1754, Ben Franklin drafted the Albany Plan of Union, and this attempted to unify the colonies for a mutual defense. It did, in fact, fail, but it would set the stage for other things. During the French and Indian War, the English and the French battled for colonial domination in North America, the Caribbean, and even in India. All right, so this was the first attempt at a united American government. Essentially, England forced the colonists to fight in the war and pay the cost of the war in terms of taxes. In 1763, the Royal Proclamation of 1763 was issued by King George III. This happened on October 7th, and this followed Great Britain's acquisition of French territory in North America after the end of the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War. And essentially, it forbade all settlement west of the line drawn along the Appalachian Mountains. Now, as I said before, between 1651 and 1765, Great Britain really didn't enforce its laws in the colonies, including most taxation. It left the colonies alone. Well, after the French and Indian War, guess what? Great Britain needed money. Okay, it was an incredibly expensive war. Remember, they were fighting in North America, they were fighting in the Caribbean, as well as in India. So that took a ton of money. And once Great Britain figured out how much money and how much debt they acquired during the French and Indian War, they looked to the colonists to start getting that money back. So in 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act. All right, this was a tax on common goods such as paper, stamps, cards, licenses, magazines, legal documents. And the colonists decided to boycott or refuse to buy any British good in response to the taxes. Now, think about colonial life for a moment. Did they have iPads? No. Did they have technology? No. So everything was on paper. Okay. The Stamp Act was incredibly wide reaching and impacted fundamental life in the colonies. Now, to say that the colonists were angry would be an understatement. So what they did was they gathered together in 1765. So 9 colonies met and sent a declaration against British actions to King George. Now remember, this is the first time a majority of the colonies joined together to oppose anything. All right. And the effect here was that Great Britain actually listened. Okay. They repealed or canceled the Stamp Act. So this unification by the colonies had a positive impact on the colonists' lives. Now, just 2 years later, we have the Townshend Acts. Now, again, think back to what we just talked about. Okay, the colonists came together. They opposed the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act went away. 2 years later, in 1767, now we have a new type of taxes. Okay, the Townshend Acts, they were taxes on a variety of goods, including paper, paint, lead, glass, and tea. Okay, and this allowed British customs officers to search for smuggling. So, again, the Stamp Act, it influenced colonists at a very minute level. But now we're seeing in the Townshend Acts that the British are allowing customs officers to search for smuggling. That's gonna be a really strong kind of opposition that's going to gain strong opposition from the colonists. They are not going to like that. And in doing so, the colonists began to cause trouble for the officials because they believed taxation was wrong. They mainly believed it was wrong because they were not being represented in England. So I'm sure you've seen this picture. No taxation without representation. The colonists were trying to drive home the point that they did not have a say in the government of England, and therefore they did not want taxes. And not just that they didn't want taxes, but that it wasn't fair. All right, so the colonists are really harping on this idea of fairness because they're saying, hey, we don't have anyone in England in Parliament looking out for our best interests. Instead, people are looking at us as a cash cow, that they can simply tax us. They can tax our imports. They can tax our exports. They can make sure that we can't trade with anyone else, that we can't get good deals. And that the British officials are actually going to start making sure that the colonists are being faithful to the law. Okay. And that's, again, before 1765, we had not seen the British act this way towards the colonists. Now, by 1770, we see things really heating up. Okay, we have the Boston Massacre. This is where British soldiers fired into a crowd, killing 5 people. Now, we don't have to talk about any conspiracy theories in this class, but I will tell you that history has maybe told a different story, and recent historians are really looking into whether or not it was a British soldier that fired first, or if it was a colonist. But at any rate, the same outcome happened. Crispus Attucks, and he was shot and killed, and he was the first African American to die for the revolution, and he was also one of the first patriots to give his life for the cause. Now, 3 years after the Boston Massacre, we have the Tea Act, which is passed in 1773. And this act granted the company the right to ship its tea directly to the colonies without first landing it in England, and to commission agents who would have the sole right to sell the tea in the colonies. Now, think about something. We're talking about a company, okay? We're seeing the Parliament tell us that all tea business has to go to the British East India Tea Company. Now, although their taxes would have been cheaper, the colonists were fed up with England making decisions for them. They couldn't get tea from anywhere else. And again, this is really starting to wear on the colonists. Later that year, we see colonist anger really boil over, and we see the Boston Tea Party in 1773. All right, the Sons of Liberty dumped tea into the Boston Harbor in rebellion of the Tea Act. Their main goal was to protest British Parliament's tax on tea. So thinking back to this whole idea of no taxation without the representation. The leader of the Boston Tea Party was Sam Adams. Again, Sam Adams and the Sons of Liberty carried out this attack on December 16th, 1773. It has been estimated in current times that the amount of tea that was disposed of would have a value today of several $million. After the Boston Tea Party in 1773, King George has had enough, and he passes the Intolerable Acts. This was direct punishment for Boston Tea Party. What he did was he closed the Boston Harbor. He banned all town meetings. He restricted colonists' civil rights, including trial by jury. We're going to come back to that one in a second. He imposed the Quartering Act, which required colonists to provide living quarters and supplies for British troops. And overall, the English government was being incredibly abusive to the colonists at this point. Now think about this. King George is essentially saying, hey, colonists, I'm super upset that you have continued to act in this manner, and I'm going to impose all of these things on you. But one of the biggest things I'm going to do to you is I'm going to take away your ability to have a trial by jury. Remember, the trial by jury has been around since the Magna Carta. That was the whole point of the Magna Carta, right? Was to establish this relationship between the king and his citizens. So for the king to now say, hey, under the Intolerable Acts, you are not going to have a trial by jury. Any colonist that is accused of anything is going to now go before a British judge, okay, and not have a jury of their peers. That is going to be a huge sticking point as we move into the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution. So, shortly thereafter, the First Continental Congress meets in 1774, and they met to demand that rights be restored after the Intolerable Acts. And they wanted the British to know that they would continue to boycott all British goods if the king did not back down. So they wrote a letter to the king, and after the First Continental Congress, they swore that they would meet again and continue to discuss kind of how they were going to move forward as a united front. After the First Continental Congress, colonists started stockpiling weapons just in case things got a little heated. But remember, at this point, colonists were not really advocating for a revolution. They were advocating for change, but not a revolution. I don't think it was the common sentiment at this point that there would be a revolution and a full split from Great Britain. At this time, it was more the colonists wanted to be heard. They wanted taxation with representation, and they wanted King George to leave them alone. However, in 1775, we have the shot heard around the world at Lexington and Concord. Here, the British come upon some colonists stockpiling weapons, and they attack the colonists. Now, it is unclear, again, who fired that first shot, but the colonists go on to win the battle, and Lexington and Concord become known as the first battle of the American Revolution. Once the first shots rang out at Lexington and Concord, there was no going back. And the Patriots decided that they had to get the common folk on their side. And Thomas Paine wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense in 1775 and 76. And here he advocates independence from Great Britain to people in the 13 colonies. His writing is clear and persuasive, and he really talked about the moral and political arguments to encourage everyday people in the colonies to begin fighting for a separation from England. So at the end of the day, Thomas Paine, Common Sense, wanted to separate from England, and he wanted normal farmers, everyday people to kind of come to that conclusion based on his arguments presented in Common Sense. Also, though, I do find the title of it, Common Sense, a little bit sarcastic and kind of funny as well. So now we have the Second Continental Congress in 1775, and they are meeting to decide what to do about the open fighting between the British and the colonists. They have a divided opinion. Again, there is no clear option here. Okay, remember the Redcoats, they are a professional army. The colonists are advocating for change, but not necessarily a full split from Great Britain. Now we start seeing this division between citizens in the colonies. You either become a patriot, so you want change, you want to be divided from England, you want to be independent, or you were a loyalist. Again, you could still advocate change, but you are inherently loyal to the king and Great Britain. By July 4th of 1776, we still have full-blown fighting going on with the British and the colonists. But we have Thomas Jefferson sit down and write the Declaration of Independence. He borrowed a ton of ideas from John Locke, and we've already talked about a lot of those. And his main purpose for writing the Declaration of Independence was to argue legitimacy for the cause to Parliament and to support the cause, boost troop morale, and inform other countries, i.e. France, hey, we are advocating for our own independence now, and you know what? We might need an ally. Okay, so the Declaration of Independence had three main goals, okay? To argue for legitimacy to Parliament, okay? To gain support for their cause, so boost troop morale, and to inform other countries, i.e. France, that the colonies were kind of in the market for a new ally. So this wraps up part one of, this wraps up 1.3, Causes of the American Revolution. And our next lecture is going to deep dive into the Declaration of Independence. All right, thanks.